Welcome to the MYS Virtual Hangout. Here's your host, MYS Music Director, Raul Gomez.
Good afternoon, Portland, Metropolitan Youth Symphony students and families and friends around the world. I was happy to see on Facebook a bunch of friends from New Orleans and from Costa Rica tuning in as well. We have a very special show this afternoon. David Schiff is joining us. He's a Portland-based composer, author, conductor. He was, until recently, working at Reed College here in Portland. The Metropolitan Youth Symphony also recently performed a piece by his concerto for jazz violin entitled Four Sisters, and we had the amazing jazz violinist Regina Carter come and play as a soloist for that concert, which happened on March 8th, basically the week before everything shut down. So we were very excited that we were able to get that concert in before we all had to go into isolation. Mr. Schiff's music, draws from elements of all different genres and style, jazz and rock and klezmer, and he's influenced by composers very diverse like Stravinsky, Mahler, Mingus, Terry Riley, and we're very excited to have him. I'm personally very excited to have him, and he's standing by, and let's see if the technology gods smile upon us, and we should be ready to go. And here you are, David Schiff. Welcome to the Metropolitan Youth Symphony Virtual Hangout.
Great to be here.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
How's so you were until recently at Reed College, and you retired from that job. When was that?
So I arrived at Reed in 1980, and I taught my last class a year ago. So I've just had just about a year of retirement now, and it's interesting. Just a couple of days over 40 years ago, when we were living in New York and we were planning our move to Portland, we turned on the TV to watch the news in the morning, and what happened? Mount St. Helens was exploding. And we were saying, oh my God, we're moving there.
Well, I'm so glad that didn't deter you.
No, but our first year when we got here in August of 1980, everything was still covered with ash in Portland. So that was a kind of surprise, but life is full of surprises.
Well, and how do you feel about the timing of your retirement at Reed and then this crazy stuff that's going on? I mean,
well, in some ways, it's easier not to be teaching now, and it's easier just to devote myself to composing, which is what I'm doing. I'm not retired from composing, and as composers, we basically stay at home anyhow. No matter what the conditions are. Of course, I miss my students and my friends at Reed, but I certainly had a wonderful long career there. And I'll tell you the story, one aspect of the job. When I was hired by Reed, it was for what was a kind of standard slot back then, which was a theory composition slot. And all the interviews were, how do you teach theory? How do you teach composition? Things like that. And then I arrived at Reed, and my first day, somebody said to me, oh, by the way, you're going to conduct the orchestra.
Surprise.
Surprise, surprise. So the first thing I did when I picked myself off the floor is I made myself a lunch date with Jacob Avshalomov, because I knew his son from New York. And he gave me some very helpful advice about what to do. And for years, I mean, the thing that saved me as a conductor is I had played in orchestras. I'm a recovering double bass player, so I kind of knew the drill. And I had friends who were conductors and friends who were orchestra players, and they were very good in giving advice about what pieces are hard and what pieces are easy. And, you know, to the end, I always wanted to do Mozart 39, and my string player friend said, no, 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 no.
Yeah, those are hard. All those late, I mean, everything Mozart is hard, but those late symphonies also just, you know, for just lots of notes also.
Yes.
For many people. Have you conducted before?
Only, at that point, I had only conducted my own music. I had a one conducting course at Manhattan School of Music. It was a course which was just for non-conductors, and we conducted a pianist. We were never allowed any place near an orchestra, and that was basically it.
And then so you jumped right into that in addition to your composition and other teaching, and you got to do that at Reed then for nearly 40 years.
And in time, it became my favorite part of the job. Mm. And the thing that really helped me was about 15 years ago. I went to the conductors retreat at Medomik, conductors camp, for the first time. And originally I was invited there because at that point I was pretty active as a journalist. I was writing to New York Times, and they wanted me to write something about the program there. And I liked it so much, I asked if I could come back as a participant. And I did that, and I met a lot of wonderful young conductors, and Ken Kiesler, who was the conducting teacher there, was a wonderful teacher. And it was the first time I finally had some sense that I knew what I was doing, however vaguely.
I
have a lot of respect. I have a lot of respect for conductors because of that experience.
It's so weird, right? Because I mean, you can take a conducting class and work with a pianist or with a small ensemble of your peers, and yes, you're going to learn things, but to stand up in front of the orchestra, like there's no way to practice that except with an orchestra.
Exactly.
So in a way, you're just learning on the job as you go, and hope that you're lucky enough to have the chance to stand in front of an orchestra in the first place.
Right.
Now, before we go on, there's a game that we play on this show, as you know, Two Truths and a Lie. And your statements that you sent us to play this game are just so beautiful and concise and amazing that I want to share those right away with our viewers so that they can vote on the comments for which of the statements is the lie. So let's set those up, and then we'll continue chatting. So will you please read your statements in order, starting with statement A?
So the three statements, which may or may not be true, are I had dinner with Philip Glass. I had dinner with Steve Reich. I usually do.
Very good. So those are up on the screen. So if you're watching on YouTube or if you're watching on Facebook, the way this works is on the comments, you can just simply type A, B, or C, and we're going to be voting for which of those statements you believe is a lie. And they're up on the screen. We're going to leave those up for a little bit longer. So you were born in New York. Yes, and of course at the Metropolitan Youth Symphony we have, close to 600 students of all ages and backgrounds, and orchestra, bands, and jazz. And one thing that they and I always enjoy getting to know about our guests is their beginnings in music and childhood and teenage years. So how did you get started?
Well, I must say it's sort of a mystery to me because I come from a totally unmusical family and no musicians. I have two cousins of my generation who were musicians, but no one in the family knew anything about music. But two things happened early on. And again, one of them had nothing to do with me, although my reaction did. My father had been in the Army. And when he got home, while he was away, my mother found the family an apartment in the Bronx. And she was very excited because it was hard to find housing back then. He got back from the Army, and he was not amused by what he saw. The apartment was on the 5th floor of a walk-up building. And it was not a palace. And so he wanted to get something for the apartment that would make it a little better. So what he purchased, I think when I was 3, was an AM/FM receiver with a 3-speed turntable. And later I found out this was absolutely state of the art for 1948, 1949. These were absolutely new products. And the other thing that they did shortly was, because they didn't know anything about music, back then there was a thing called Book of the Month Club, which was very popular. And it was a subscription, and they sent you a new book every month that they thought you should read. And the Book of the Month Club set up a kind of subsidiary called the Music Appreciation Club. And it was the same thing, and you would get a record once a month. And the gimmick of the records is that there was music on one side and then a kind of explanation of the music on the other.
Oh.
So
did you get to keep them too? Basically,
yeah,
they're yours.
At the time, within a very short time of the arrival of this magnificent mahogany thing, I took it over. By the time I was 4 years old, I was running the radio and the phonograph all day. And one of the first recordings to arrive, there were 2 recordings that had a tremendous impact. One, my parents bought, and that was the original cast recording of South Pacific. And I listened to that day and night. And it was brand new in 1950. And then around the same time, the first recording we got from Music Appreciation Society, surprisingly enough, was La Mer of Debussy, conducted by Funkarian. It's still my favorite performance. And I bonded with that piece. I listened to that piece day and night for years. It was me. Again, I couldn't explain why that happened. Except it happened. Around the same time, and this is a little more mysterious, I demanded piano lessons. And it's not clear where I got the idea, but my parents obliged me, and they got an upright piano. This way, we had moved to an elevator apartment building by then, a few blocks away. And there was a nice upright piano. And so when I was 4 or 5, I started piano lessons. So that's how I started. And I had a series of teachers. What happened to me, again, I try to figure out why this was the case. I very quickly became this crackerjack sight reader. And I just spent the day sight reading, which means I never really learned to practice, because when you're sight reading, you're faking all the time. But I just wanted to explore music. And there it was, and any music I can get my hands on, I was busy doing that. And when I was 9 years old, I started taking piano lessons at a music school which still exists called Bronx House. And they had a requirement that if you were taking piano lessons, you had to have theory class. And one day in that theory class, the instructor, Kenneth Wentworth, put on a record, and it was Billy the Kid of Aaron Copland. And I heard that, and I immediately said to myself, you're going to be a composer. That was, it flipped the switch. And on the exam, for the theory exam at the end of the term, he handed out music paper and said, I think it was something like, write a waltz just at your desk. And I did it. So, and it was funny because when the grades came out, my piano teacher just didn't think I had anything going for me. And I got this A in theory, and she pulled me into the theory class because she was convinced he had made some kind of mistake because I was hopeless. So, but in retrospect, I was thinking from very early on, I was really preparing myself to be a composer, not a performer.
So you knew so early on. I mean, that's so early. So did you then? So was there at any point any consideration that you would work professionally in any other field?
Oh, plenty. Because
okay.
my family, I didn't know any professional musicians in the family.
So you knew you wanted to compose, but not necessarily.
I knew I wanted to compose, but I had no idea what I was going to do with it. And then somehow, by the time I got to high school, I turned out to be the star student in English class. And so when I went to college at Columbia, I majored in English. But I spent all my time hanging with people who knew about music, because there were a lot of people in my classes at Columbia. They weren't musicians necessarily, but they had opinions about music, and they knew a lot about music. And they say, "What? You've never listened to Bruckner? What's the matter with you? Don't you know this piece?" And so I really spent a lot of time educating myself. At Columbia, there was a brand new thing. This was in the early 1960s. It was an era when all of a sudden there was a proliferation of new music groups, contemporary music groups. And one of the first was at Columbia. It was called the Group for Contemporary Music. And it had been founded the year before I arrived there. And I would go to every concert, and they would play what was considered the advanced music then. For one thing, they were playing Schoenberg, Berg, and Webern when nobody else was playing it. But they also played a lot of Stefan Volpe and Elliott Carter and Milton Babbitt and Edgar Varese. And in fact, Carter and Varese and Volpe were usually in attendance. You had these kind of legendary figures. So that was very exciting. And eventually I decided I didn't like a lot of the music they were playing, but it was still, I learned a tremendous amount just in terms of repertory, and it was wonderful being able to hear it performed live.
And before we dive a little deeper into your graduate music making that you have going on as a player, and when did you start playing bass?
So I was taking piano lessons all that time. And then when I was going into 5th grade, we moved to the suburbs. We moved to New Rochelle, New York, which had an amazing music program in the schools. Every elementary school had a full-time instrumental person and a choral person. The instrumental person in my school, Ralph Friedman, was a violinist who had played in the NBC Symphony under Toscanini.
Wow.
When I found out that there was this program, I told my mother, go speak to the instrumental teacher. I want to play something. And she came home. My mother didn't know anything about music. And she said, "Okay, you're going to play the tuba." So, because, she didn't know, so from 5th grade on, I played the tuba. And I played in marching band all the way through junior high school and high school. And also during the summer, they had a summer music program, and I played tuba. And the summer before 7th grade, I went to the conductor of the summer program. And I said, "Isn't this something else I can play?" And he said, "Well, there's a double bass over there. Why don't you figure out?" Very good, sort of a community orchestra called the Westchester Philharmonic, which was a community orchestra, but with a lot of the best ringers from New York. And I had amazing experiences. I mean, I'll never forget my audition for that was Sibelius Second, and they just stuck the music in front of me. And I remember, the second movement begins with a double bass pizzicato, and I had never seen tenor clef before. And halfway through, I'm reading it, and there's this tenor clef, and what the hell is that? But they took me anyhow. And so I learned, that experience of being in a really good orchestra, playing wonderful music on the bass. And then I also went to music camp in upstate New York, which the conductor was Maestro Richard Karp, who was the conductor of the Pittsburgh Opera for many years. And I had a wonderful piano teacher there named Jimmy Weimer. And it's sort of hard to imagine. Weimer gave me a 4-hour piano lesson every day for the entire summer.
Wow.
And he really wasn't a pianist. He was a musician. He was teaching me musicianship. We read through all the Beethoven and Brahms symphonies, four hands, and analyzed them at the same time. And I decided to compose something there, and I wrote a little prelude and fugue for woodwind trio, and it was performed there. And Herr Dr. Richard Karp, the maestro, came up to me and said, "Schiff, you're a composer." So that
You were anointed.
I was anointed at that point.
And all the while, through high school and through playing with these orchestras, you're writing music.
Well, I was trying. And I would, again, I being in New York, it was wonderful. And also because Jimmy Weimer was my teacher, he took me to a lot of concerts. So I would go to the library and take scores out and recordings out, and I'd go to concerts. I'll never forget one concert I went to in high school. It was at the New School, and it was all Alban Berg. And Bethany Beardsley sang the 7 early songs, and Edward Storyman played the Berg piano sonata. And I ran home and I wrote this imitation of the Berg piano sonata because I just loved it so much. I wanted to do something like that. So I should say at the same time I was doing this, I was also in a band, a kind of dance band as it was, and with very good friends of mine. We were all very interested in jazz. So we were listening to jazz. And even when, it's hard to imagine now, when we were 12 or 13, our parents let us go into the city on Saturday night, and we would hang out outside of jazz clubs because they wouldn't let us in, listening. And one of my best friends was named Peter Kogan, and he went on to become a timpanist of the Minnesota Orchestra. And he was very knowledgeable about jazz, and he really educated me about things. So I was hearing a lot of different kinds of music.
Did you, at that point, or even while you were going to Columbia for English, did you envision an intersection of those worlds in your writing?
I was not envisioning anything. I was a kind of double agent. I was living this funny life where I was doing very well in English and was rewarded for that. And yet I was spending so much time with music, and it was what I was caring about. And I really didn't resolve this until I was 25, when I was in a doctoral program at Columbia in English. and I just couldn't do it anymore.
Mm.
And I made a very good decision. I decided to kind of test the waters by going to summer school at Manhattan School of Music, which was right across the street from Columbia. And I just registered and I took a placement test and I placed into the second year theory class. And I was very lucky in that the person teaching the class was Ludmila Udlela. And Miss Udlela was a great theory teacher, but she was also the head of composition and theory at Manhattan School. And I did well in the class. And at the end of the class, I said to her, I'd really like to apply to the school in composition. What should I do? She said, write me a violin sonata. So, because I didn't have much to show for my interest at that point. So sure. She wanted something that she could show. And so I got in, so I went to Manhattan School. And it was a big turning point for me because I had literally never set foot in a conservatory until then. And I never thought I would belong there. I never thought that was me. And as soon as I walked into that building, I was happy. And I made friends. I just felt, oh, this is where I should have been all along, but I just didn't know it.
But you were already into a doctoral program in English at this point.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that. I thought it was a bit of a more linear transition between your undergraduate and grad.
It was kind of...
And did you, during those years, in the New York scene and composers and composition teachers, did you have anybody in mind that you said to yourself, I would like to study under this person, or this is the path that I want to follow in terms of just style or sounds?
Well, I was listening to a lot of different kinds of music then. And when I got to Manhattan School, my first 2 years, I studied with John Curliano. He was just starting out then. And then my third year, I studied with Ursula Mamluk, a wonderful composer, and she had studied with Stefan Volpa, who was one of these avant-garde figures. And so she had a different perspective. But the other thing that happened around the same time, I forget the exact date. I went to a concert at Columbia, and it wasn't in the usual place where new music concerts were. It wasn't at Miller Theater. It was at the Student Union, and it was a concert by the Steve Reich Ensemble. And it was the first concert of new music where there were more people in the hall at the end than at the beginning. Usually people flee. And I said to myself, this guy is really onto something. So Steve's music, I had already been listening to some Terry Riley. I'd performed some Terry Riley, but Steve Reich's music had a big impact on me. And then from the time I was in high school, I had this great love for the music of Elliott Carter. And eventually I was able to study with Carter for 3 years at Juilliard. And people always say, how do you get from Reich to Carter to this? I just did,
Yeah. And I want to ask you about your time with Elliott Carter and your relationship with him too. And of course, this book.
That's right.
That you wrote on Elliott Carter. But you did send us a couple of movements, pieces that you wrote that we're going to listen together. I want to talk about them. And because we're talking about your time at the Manhattan School of Music in Juilliard, I would love to start with the divertimento, the movement that you sent us from your opera, Gimpo the Fool. So could I ask you to introduce this piece? Maybe let's do it like a short version introduction, and then we'll listen to it, and then we'll talk in detail, because I'm just so fascinated with this opera and the process and everything. So if you don't mind introducing the movement that we're about to hear.
So this is the Divertimento from Gimple the Fool, which I arranged from music for the opera for Chamber Music Northwest in 1982, just after we moved to Portland. The opera started in a class at Manhattan School taught by Nicholas Flagello, a class in opera composition, and we had an assignment to write a libretto. And I had just discovered the stories of Isaac Bashevis Singer, which were quite a revelation for me because he was describing a part of the world that my grandparents had come from, but they never talked about it. So it gave me a sense of what their life was. And Gimple the Fool is his most famous story. So I decided to do an opera based on it. And then I had a crazy idea, which was since Stravinsky had written an opera in Latin, Oedipus Rex, I said, if he can write an opera in Latin, I'll write an opera in Yiddish, which was the original language of Singer's story. So I did that. And so the story of Gimple is the baker in the town of Frampol in Galicia in southern Poland. And he's a big, strong guy, and he's a successful baker. But he has this one characteristic, which comes out early in his life, which is that he believes whatever anybody tells him. So from very early on in his life, people take advantage of him. They play tricks on him. They tell him things. They tell him stories. And as things go on, as he becomes established as baker, the people in the town figure out the biggest trick they're going to play on him is to marry him off to a woman who lives at the edge of the town who, let's say, keeps all the men in the town happy. So the first act of Gimple ends with a big wedding scene, and it's a kind of grotesque scene because I think it's like a black mass because it's a wedding, but it's a fake wedding. And I wanted to write a kind of sentimental waltz for that scene. So that's what this, the wedding song from Gimple is, that waltz.
Very nice. So we're going to listen to this right now, and then we'll talk more about the piece. Here it is. Enjoy. Yeah, turn my audio back on. Okay, so thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Okay.
So, did you know of Singer's work? Were you familiar with his work before you got interested in this project specifically, or how did it come about? Your interest in his work specifically?
It was really just before. It's kind of accident. In fact, what happened, and again, it's the counterpoint of my life. At that point, I had taken a job teaching music theory at Hebrew Union College School of Sacred Music, school where cantors study, which turned out to be very important in my life. And again, just as at Reed, they said the first day, oh, by the way, you'll conduct the orchestra. I got there the first day to teach music theory, and the dean kind of looked at me and said, oh, you have a degree in English literature, don't you? I said, yes. I said, good, you can teach a humanities class. Here, we need one. So I came up with a reading list for a humanities class at this school for rabbis and cantors. And the name Isaac Bashevis Singer was in the air at that point, and I hadn't read him. So I said, oh, I'll assign this, and that way I'll read some Isaac Bashevis Singer. So that's how I discovered him. And then, of course, I read every word that he wrote because I liked it so much.
And he went on to win the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1974. And
Yes.
you got to ask him in person directly, right, if you could use his text for an opera. How was that encounter?
He was lovely. I went down, he was giving a reading downtown New York, and I walked up to him and I said I was interested. He said, very good. He said, talk to my publisher. He knew that there was a legal side of this that he couldn't deal with, but he gave his blessing to it. So I was on my way.
And one thing that I love about, when I read about this opera is that after that happened, after you got your green light basically to start working on the project, you spent time with your grandfather.
Yes.
Getting familiar with the text and the world, and how was that like?
Well, because the story was originally written in Yiddish, it was translated into English by Saul Bellow, and that's the way people know it. But I had this crazy idea to have it in Yiddish, and so I wanted to read it in Yiddish or as close to that as I could. And I didn't read Yiddish, I didn't speak Yiddish, but my grandfather spoke Yiddish. He barely spoke English, and my uncle would go with me, and he would read the story to my grandfather in Yiddish. And my grandfather, who had actually been a baker in Warsaw, explained things to us. And one of the things I discovered was that in the original, it has a lot more flavor and it's a lot raunchier and funnier than it is in English. So that helped keep me on this path of doing it in Yiddish, although that created complications in terms of performance, but it made me want to do it. I should say the big surprise for me with Gimpel when I started composing, so here I was listening to all sorts of avant-garde music and Boulez and Stockhausen and Carter and music like that. And then the summer of 1975, I started writing the opera. And one day I was in Midtown Manhattan. I was waiting to pick up some kind of stereo equipment. They said, come back in an hour. And I sat down in the park, and all of a sudden the overture of the opera just came into my head. And fortunately, I had a music notebook with me. I wrote it down, sitting there. And I looked at it, I said, oh my God, it's in E minor. And I don't think I had written anything tonal, since I was 12, and it just sort of happened. And the other thing I learned as I went on to compose the opera is that I had a tremendous amount of Jewish music inside me. And so writing the opera was the easiest thing I had ever done. It was just, the music was all there.
And then the first performance of the first version of this work was given, as I read, as part of a celebration of Yiddish culture at your synagogue.
Yes. And so we did it, and because I was teaching at Hebrew Union College, my students sang the roles, and this was just a version with piano and voice. One of my students at Hebrew Union College was not singing, but she was turning pages for me. I was playing piano. And my parents were in the audience, and they thought that was interesting that she was turning pages, and they invited us all out to dinner. And that was the beginning of a beautiful relationship. So that the page turner was soon my wife, Judy.
Yeah.
And she sang in later productions of the opera.
So
Not
you met through the school where you were teaching.
Yes.
Yeah. That's such a cool story. And how quickly did the opera transition and evolve from that original version to a fully, to its final instrumentation, its final form?
Well, so the first performance was in the fall of 75. Then we did it in New York in January 76. And then I think a year later, it was about a half hour long. And so it was growing. And we performed it in Boston. And then it was just kind of sitting as these things happen. And then I was invited to put together a performance of a Jewish opera called Goat's Milk, which was going to be performed at the 92nd Street Y. And I put together the cast and we performed it. And at the party afterwards, one of the performers, Lawrence Avery, who was the cantor at the synagogue where I grew up, a great cantor, a legendary figure, said, so everyone could hear it, "This is the beginning of Jewish opera at the Y, a new series." And that planted the seed. And then from that, in 1979, the Y did the first production of The Complete Gimple. And for that, I orchestrated it and I made it a full evening of music. And then the Y revived it. So the three performances in 79, they brought it back in 80. I'm sorry, it was 78 and 79 is the right dates. And then they wanted to do it again in 85. And at that point, I decided, this was before super titles. And I decided that the Yiddish was a kind of barrier. There were people in the audience who were Yiddish speaking who loved it, but there were a lot of people who couldn't understand it. So I did an English translation of the entire thing, so that now there are two different versions. And then finally, in 2004, we recorded it here. And I actually wrote some additional music. So between 1975 and 2004, this opera just grew. But I think it's finished now.
And I was excited to find an article on the New York Times from May 18, 1979, that is about this performance at the 92nd Street Y. I enjoyed reading through it. At the end, it says tickets for the performance are $4, $5, and $6.50, and they can be bought by calling this number. And very cool. Let's transition to the other piece that we're going to listen to, and this is a much more recent composition from the year 2000, if I remember correctly, and this is one movement of several from your New York Nocturnes.
Yes.
So will you talk to us a little bit about these pieces and specifically about this movement we're about to hear?
So New York Nocturnes, I composed for the Golub Kaplan Carr Trio. I was commissioned through Chamber Music Northwest in 2000. And the idea of the piece, it was kind of my memories of New York, especially New York in the 1970s. New York in the 1970s is sort of the New York you know from movies. It was a different, very different place from now. It was dirty, it was smelly, it was dangerous. It was also very, very creative. All sorts of things were going on. And it was a very exciting time in my life. And whenever I compose a piece, I like to take the challenge of translating the memories of a time and a place as much as I can in musical terms. So I set myself this challenge. And one of the movements is called Five Spot. The Five Spot was a very famous jazz club. And I used to go there, and I often heard Thelonious Monk play and Charles Mingus play there. So this is my homage to them, especially to Monk.
Very good. And this is a recording by the Apollo Trio. So let's listen to David Schiff's Five Spot from his New York Nocturnes. Here we go. Okay, very nice. And this is a great performance by the Apollo Trio also, and a great recording. Let me make sure. Okay, yeah, I think mics are on. So here, this piece of music, of course, the language, the idiom in it is very close to the world of jazz. And as I said towards the beginning of this hour, quite recently at the Metropolitan Youth Symphony, we performed a work of yours that shares that element with this piece we just heard. And of course, this is your Concerto for Jazz Violin for Sisters. When did you write the violin concerto?
In 1997.
Okay, so there's only about 3 years between that piece and this piece.
Right.
Did one influence the other? The concerto influence your writing for the violin here?
Well, the pieces are different in a way because the piano trio is written for classical players who have to figure out how to sound like the jazz players. And from the beginning, Four Sisters was written for a jazz violinist, and it has a large component of improvisation in it. So I write, I've written pieces which are just for jazz performers. I've written pieces that mix jazz performers with classical. I've written jazzy pieces for classical players. I do it different ways like that.
And specifically about the jazz violin concerto, Regina Carter has taken that piece and she's sort of made it her own. She's performed it several times. Last one of those with us, March 8th, right before everything closed down. I'm so glad we were able to squeeze that concert in. It would have been very disappointing to not be able to play that. But for our students, the Metropolitan Youth Symphony, it was a really wonderful challenge to tackle this piece, because it's a wonderful piece that's not easy to play, from a technical standpoint for the instrumentalist. It's very well written, and it's idiomatically very well written for the instruments, but it's still it's a challenging piece to play and also to put together as an orchestra. So for all of us, it was an amazing learning experience. And then on top of that, to be able to play with the amazing Regina Carter was a spectacular opportunity for all of us. And it was fun to do it. And I'm so glad we got to do it. And I'm so glad that you trusted us to do it.
Well, I must say, I was so delighted with the performance. I've had performances of that piece by the Detroit Symphony and Chicago Sinfonietta, and this was just as good. And MYS just did a beautiful job, and it's always, for me, it's such a thrill to work with Regina. I think she's given 10 performances of this piece so far, performances, and about half of her part is improvised, and she never does it the same way twice. So she always has something new to bring to the piece, and it's just an honor for me that she's doing that with this sort of framework that I've set up for her.
Yes, and she was so generous with her time too. She worked with her students in master classes and workshops, and it was a really joyful and wonderful week that we had, which, personally, it makes me miss even more making music with our students and with other people. We were able to play the concert, and we are certainly looking forward to the next time that we can all get together and make music. And for those of you watching and listening, the title of this concerto is Four Sisters. And do yourself a favor and look that up online and listen to it if you can. It's an amazing piece of music. And we, the Metropolitan Youth Symphony, will have our archival recording of that performance that we can also make available for our students. But before we run out of time, we have a few more things to do here. And the first one of them is we need to get to the bottom of your two truths and a lie here, and your dinner experiences with great composers. And if you're watching, I want to remind you, if you have not voted, to go ahead and vote on the comments, A, B, or C. One of these is a lie. And why don't we go ahead and reveal your first truth, one of your truths?
I had dinner with Pierre Boulez. Actually, it was Pierre Boulez and Elliott Carter. January 1971 in Cleveland. where I went because Boulez was conducting Carter's Concerto for Orchestra, which is probably the hardest piece ever written for orchestra. And I was able to go to rehearsals for a week and hang out with Pierre Boulez.
Mm. How was he as a dinner partner? How is he a conversationalist?
In French, it was mostly in French. He was pretty scary. I think in the years that followed that, he mellowed quite a bit, and he could actually be funny and kind of lighten up. But he was very, very intense. And it was a pretty heavy dinner, as I recall.
And did Mr. Carter have a friendship with him, or more of a working relationship?
Yes. Well, this was the beginning of that. Boulez had chosen this piece. He had never conducted Carter before that, and I think Boulez himself said, here he was conducting the Cleveland Orchestra, the best orchestra in the world, and he said, I picked this piece because it's a challenge, because it's so hard, and subtext, and I'm the only one who knows how to put it together. And true, I mean, he was amazing at rehearsals. He was kind of terrifying because he had this ear, so he would stop and he'd point to, third stand viola, that A flat is under. They called him the French correction. That was, but it was a pretty serious dinner.
Wow. And okay, that let's then reveal your final truth here. Was it which of the two you had dinner with?
Well, I wish I would have dinner sometime with Phil Glass, but I never had the honor, the pleasure. I've met him, but it never happened. We had a wonderful dinner with Steve Reich in New York in the 70s. I guess it was in 1978. And the way I know the date is because both his wife and my wife were pregnant at the time. And they started talking, and they started attending natural childbirth classes together. But in the middle of dinner, when Steve found out that Judy was a cantor, he invited her to record, to chant the opening of Genesis, because he was collecting recordings of that. And he actually used these recordings in his composition. So I don't know if he actually used Judy's version of it, but that was one of the highlights of the dinner.
Very cool. Okay, so there you have it, folks. A was the lie. No dinner with Philip Glass yet.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we'll see. Can I ask you, those behind you on top of that shelf, I see some masks, or what are those? Is there a story behind them?
They're African sculpture that my late father-in-law, Judy's father, acquired when he was in the army in Egypt.
Oh,
the Second World War, and so they're part of the inspiration in my studio.
Nice. And well, before we have to let you go, just a couple of things. When you're not writing music or teaching or conducting, what are you into that's not related specifically to your musical endeavors?
Well, these days, I think definitely making pizza.
Oh.
Is what I do. I found I'm a morning composer. I like to be in my studio by 8 a.m, if not 7. And around 1 p.m, I stop believing in myself and I need to do something else. And so I find that one of the things I do that I really enjoy is cooking. And some years ago, we got a book on how to make your own pizza, and I acquired a baking stone and a pizza paddle and all the things that you do. And so now I think I make the best pizza in Portland if I do say so myself.
Wow. Okay. And do you have a favorite pizza to make? A favorite type of?
I make all kinds. My latest creation that I was proud of it. We had a lot of fennel around, and it was fennel and baked fennel and blue cheese and mozzarella. It was really good.
Well, when this lockdown thing ends, I'm gonna have to find a way to invite myself to your house to try some of that pizza.
You're on.
And then as we get closer to the end here, one of my favorite segments that we do on the show, we call it Sound Advice, and we ask our guests if you, David Schiff, could go back in time magically and find 13, 14-year-old David Schiff playing piano or tuba or bass somewhere, what advice would you have for yourself at that age?
I think the simple answer would have been practice, but I think in retrospect, we're always on the right path. I mean, I think in terms of creativity, it comes out of who we are, and who we are is a kind of combination of the accidents of life, where we happen to be and who we happen to meet, and then from things that are in us which are unaccountable. And there's no recipe for how to get that mixture right. But to the extent that it's possible, if you just keep going with it, hopefully at some point, as it happened, it took me until 25. But it could have been 35. It could have been 45. So hopefully it comes together.
Very nice. Thank you for that. And finally, is there anything that you would like to plug, share with our students or viewers? Anything coming up online or any projects you're excited about?
Well, since nobody knows what's happening in the music world these days, it's hard to talk about that. But I am working on a big project. It's going to be my first symphony. I'm writing for the Eugene Symphony, and it's coming along. I got some good work done on it today, even. And it is an interesting piece because it was commissioned to be inspired by the legacy and spirit of the great runner Steve Prefontaine. The great runner from Oregon, and it's supposed to premiere June of 21. We'll see, but I'm writing it, and it's exciting. I love writing for orchestra. It's like being in a toy store, and it's fun.
That is very exciting. I'm looking forward to that. Very, very cool. Symphony number 1.
Yeah, finally.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us. As always, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. I wish we had 3 more hours, but you've been so generous to spend time with us and our students, and we're all gonna be looking forward to that symphony and its premiere in June.
It's really fun.
In June of 21. So thanks again, David Schiff. Always a pleasure. Everybody go check out his music online, and this book is just spectacular. And I've enjoyed every second I've spent with this book. That's an award-winning book as well. So go check that out too. Thank you so much, David Schiff. Talk to you soon.
Right. Thank you.
And thank you to all of you for watching. These conversations, to me, they're always just so inspiring, and we learn so much from these incredible artists. And we have more coming up. Tomorrow, Friday, May 15th, we have Casey Bozel, a violinist, teacher, podcast host. She's going to join us tomorrow at 4 a.m. Now, next week, Tuesday, May 19th, Monica Huggett, Artistic Director of the Portland Baroque Orchestra, is going to be our guest. And we're switching to a Tuesday and Thursday format starting next week. So Thursday, May 21st at 4 p.m., Anthea Creston, an amazing violinist who's played with the Berlin Philharmonic, who's played with several really, really amazing chamber ensembles. She's a fantastic teacher as well. She's going to be joining us. And then the following week, actually, that says Friday there, but that's a mistake. It's a Tuesday, May 26th. Ron Blessinger from 45th Parallel Universe here in Portland is going to be our guest. So thank you all. MYS students, if you have not registered, please go ahead and do that. Just go to our website and you can send your video auditions in between June 1st and August 14th. Everybody make sure you have this on your calendars. May 30th, 7 p.m., big online event, the Metropolitan Youth Symphony season finale concert. A live stream event, and we will premiere videos by all MYS ensembles. So I will see you all tomorrow at 4 p.m. Until then, take care. See you later.